Welcome, and thank you for joining us. My name is Professor Susan Lawrence, and I will be presenting today with my co-author, Dr. Peter Davies, and speaking on behalf of our third co-author, Dr. Lilian Pearce. We're sitting on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. The three of us are time travelers. We're archaeologists and environmental historians. We look at the footprint of past actions in the present. Here, we want to use those skills to consider one of the conference themes, the future of extractive industries. That requires time travel into the future. We urge you to consider, however, not just one point in the future, but two. One is the imagined future of what extraction might look like. The second is even further ahead, the distant, anticipated future when those imagined realities have become the past. This is where our special skills as time travelers come in. We can go back to the past, to a time when it was the present. What did they do? What choices did they make? And what choices did they make without realizing that they were making them? And then we can travel back to the future, to our present, to see the consequences of those decisions. So in our talk today, we want to frame thoughts about the future of extraction by looking at the long shadow of previous extraction, because every future will someday be the past. Our paper combines the results of research from our previous Rivers of Gold project with new research being undertaken as part of an initiative called the Lost Mines Project. The extractive industry that we're interested in is mining, and specifically mining for gold and coal in Australia. Both industries have long histories of being fundamental to the Australian economy, and both have also left lingering legacies of environmental destruction. Coal was a resource eagerly sought by the first British administration in Australia, and convict settlements were established around New South Wales and coal mines, Tasmania, in the 1820s. The industry continued to grow throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and now provides the basis for electricity in most of mainland Australia. The economic importance of gold was established following the gold rushes in Victoria and New South Wales in the 1850s. It made southeastern Australia one of the boom economies of the Pacific Rim in the 19th century and built marvelous Melbourne. By the 20th century, the centre of activity had shifted to Western Australia, which continues to be one of the world's largest gold producers. This lengthy history of mining means that abandoned mines are prominent and widespread features of the Australian landscape. One estimate by researchers studying the mining industry today suggests that there are as many as 50,000 abandoned mines around the country. Based on our previous research, we're confident that this is a conservative estimate because the data sources used omit much 19th century mining. Modern life of mine specialists want to document abandoned mines because they are concerned about toxicity and safety. These issues are just as important for 19th century mines. In fact, they're possibly more important because the mines have mostly been forgotten. This means that in many cases, communities living with industrial legacies are not even aware of it. Recent research that we've been doing as part of the Rivers of Gold project has begun to hint at the extent of the problem. Working from archival sources, we've calculated that the gold mining industry in Victoria produced over 825 million cubic meters of tailings between 1851 and the 1950s. And these tailings were distributed widely all over Victoria. The size of the pie charts in this image shows areas of greatest concentration, but the main thing is that these tailings were very widespread. Most of those tailings were sent directly into river systems. And again, the river systems impacted were all over Victoria. This map shows the stretches of river where there were documented complaints about damage to rivers in the 1880s. And we've calculated that 75% of Victoria's main river catchments were affected in some way by mine tailings. This is only the damage up to the 1880s, and we know that damage continued well into the 1920s. The impact on rivers was both immediate and long-lasting. Before mining, Victorian rivers had numerous shallow channels that connected deeper billabongs or water holes, and we can see a schematic representation of that in the top of the right-hand image. The mine tailings filled in the channels and water holes and then spilled out onto the floodplains, as depicted in the center of that right-hand image. Once mining stopped, the rivers eroded new pathways, a single channel that extended deep into the surrounding land, as the bottom part of that image shows. The thick layers of tailings on the floodplains are now visible high in the walls of these deep new channels. And that's what we can see in the image on the left, which is from a river in northeastern Victoria. You can see in that image the gray layer at the bottom is the original floodplain before mining took place. The buff or lighter colored material above that is all mine tailings that was deposited from the 1860s into the 20th century. You can see that it's a very thick deposit, and we also know that it extends well back from that river channel. In fact, we've calculated that the total amount of floodplain impacted around the state runs to hundreds of thousands of hectares. Contaminants are part of the problem as well. Tailings may include elevated levels of arsenic, mercury, and cyanide, as we have discovered in testing along the Loddon River. The ecological and public health consequences of these legacy tailings, however, have largely been overlooked and have yet to be properly assessed.
Mining in Australia starts before gold, however. The first mining industry to make a lasting impact on the Australian environment was coal. Coal was discovered at Newcastle, north of Sydney, only 3 years after the beginning of permanent white settlement began in Australia in 1788. Convicts were sent to mine the coal in 1801, and the landscape was gradually dominated by mineheads, railways, and expanded wharf facilities. Coal mining in the surrounding Hunter Valley has continued ever since, and Newcastle today remains the hub of one of Australia's richest coal fields. Coal was initially used for domestic heating and then as an industrial fuel for iron and steel working. Coal gas for lighting and cooking also emerged in the 1840s. Coal mining in the 19th century was mostly underground and had limited effects on nearby environments. It was, however, a highly dangerous working environment. In 1887, for example, a fire in a coal mine south of Sydney killed 81 miners, while in 1902 an explosion at Mount Kembla killed 96 men. The later 20th century saw a major shift from underground coal mining to large-scale open-cut techniques. Huge deposits of black coal were opened, especially in New South Wales and Queensland, while brown coal or lignite deposits were developed from the 1890s in Victoria at Anglesey, Wonthaggi and the Latrobe Valley in Gippsland. Malcolm Knox has described coal as the constant, unglamorous bread and butter of Australia's mineral production. Black and brown steaming coal was used for electricity production, while coking coal was used for iron and steel production. This figure shows the steady historical increase in Australian coal production. In 1850, there were 60,000 tonnes or so produced each year. In 2018, this had increased to more than 480 million tonnes per annum. Environmental engineer Gavin Mudd calculates that coal processing generally extracts around 80% of the raw coal as saleable product, leaving 20% as waste. On this basis, the Australian coal industry has produced, in aggregate, about 11 billion tonnes of raw coal. Despite global warming, coal mining in Australia seems likely to continue for many years to come. We have about 14% of the world's proven coal reserves, behind the US and Russia, but ahead of China, the world's largest producer and consumer of coal. Coal generates enormous revenue and wealth. Australia exported $54 billion worth of coal in 2016-17, and the industry employed more than 50,000 workers. The industry is thus politically very powerful. The coal industry has also produced, however, a range of enduring legacies across the Australian landscape. These include enormous piles of solid waste overburden, liquid tailings, and vast open-cut cavities. Coal mines can also burn. In 2014, the Hazelwood coal mine in Victoria's Latrobe Valley caught fire and burned for 45 days, sending toxic clouds of acrid smoke over nearby communities. Australia currently has 20 coal-fired power stations located in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australia. The majority are now operating beyond their design life, and most are scheduled for decommissioning over the next 15 years. What will happen to these vast, obsolete industrial monoliths and the enormous coal pits nearby? The closure of the Hazelwood plant in Victoria can give us some pointers. Hazelwood was listed as the least carbon efficient power station in the OECD when it closed in 2017, producing 3% of Australia's total greenhouse gas emissions. Burning brown coal released large amounts of pollutants into the air and water, causing significant illness and premature deaths in local communities. Decommissioning of the site will cost around $1 billion, including demolition of the plant and restoration of the surrounding area. Rehabilitation involves large-scale works, including reprofiling the coal pits to a shallower grade, managing the former mine pondage as a permanent lake, removal of plant and equipment, including asbestos, and extensive resoiling and revegetation of the surrounding area. These processes are ongoing and will take many years to complete.
The geomorphological and ecological legacies of mining operate on different timescales than human experiences. They cast long shadows of impact into the future, sometimes so far that the memories and the lasting legacies of the damage fade away in public consciousness and professional accountability. Australian environmental philosopher Val Plumwood writes of shadow places, those places that are exploited, repressed, and often forgotten in the wake of colonialism and capitalism. In the context of unceded Indigenous territory and impacted by accelerated climate change, the legacies of mining continuously morph into multiple forms. Plumwood encourages us to include places still to come as part of our responsibilities to place. The project we are now beginning looks to connect Australia's mining past with the future of the places left behind. We want to critically examine what happened to past mines when the mining stopped, how informal and formal processes transformed industrial sites into something else, and how communities then and now continue to live with these shadow places. We want to explore how mining legacies contribute to what Bjornar Olsen and Thora Petersdottir call unruly heritage, the unacknowledged but nevertheless present detritus of our society. One example is the tangible legacy left by waste dumps and tailings dams. In mining communities across Australia, remnant materials from processing operations, heavy and toxic minerals, are scattered around towns. In the arid inland town of Broken Hill, for example, these mounds double as bike jumps, where unassuming kids kick toxic dust into their faces. Lead toxicity present in Broken Hill is still considered a public health problem of global dimensions. In much of central Victoria's goldfields, such piles of sludge and tailings persist under thin layers of vegetation, unmarked and unknown. With increasingly extreme climates, vegetation die-off, bushfires, erosion, and heavy rains collude to redistribute the waste material more widely, and public health impacts spread. The legacies of extractive land use pervade the present, contributing to intergenerational stories of disadvantage and disproportionate levels of childhood disability. The inescapable legacies of mining are of particular concern for public health today. The awareness of mineral contamination varies, and poor and Indigenous communities are disproportionately affected. This is not a shock or catastrophic violence, but one that persists in a way that literary scholar Rob Nixon describes as slow violence, whereby socio-environmental injustices of the world's poor often occur at rates not easily noticeable and not well suited to big headlines. Environmental lawyer Rob White uses the term contaminated communities to describe the toxic legacies that result in detrimental consequences for local habitats and human residents. Long timescales allow contemporary mining industry partners to abscond from their complicity in past acts. In 2017, environmental scientists Louise Christensen and Mark Taylor published a paper that highlights that in many cases across the world, industrial operators concoct myths to distract the public and the authorities away from understanding and determining the true source and cause of environmental contamination. Importantly, these are not just myths that are pushed by industry, but they have made their way into public consciousness, shaped public policy, and been taken as truths by government departments. These myths managed to make the community complicit in the problem by way of being connected to the history of the local place. Questions arise regarding mining company responsibility and accountability. Mineral exploration and mining processes are central to the expansion and extraction mentality of frontier settler culture in Australia. They contribute to continent-wide environmental despoliation and contamination. Australia's pro-development ideology is underpinned by cultural assumptions that reinforce hegemonic discourses about progress and growth. In this context, mining is given high moral validity, and as anthropologist David Traeger writes, the industry perspectives become more powerful than any fears about the destructiveness of mining to the natural environment, let alone to human health. Contemporary standards for rehabilitation are on a case-by-case basis. Requirements differ according to the location, state and territory level legislation, and to the party politics of the day. The ongoing impact of mines once they have ceased operation is given little attention. The resulting abandoned mine and mining communities, state environmental consultants Corinne Unger and Ashley Van Krijken, provide memories of times past, leaving a scar on the local environment. Our project is interested in redress for legacy contamination, connecting stories of personal experience and oral history with material legacies, bringing the legacies of historic mining to the surface and enabling conversations that inform both restitution and future decision-making. Time travel allows us to see the consequences of past decisions, be they conscious or unconscious. For a long time, miners and governments consciously chose not to regulate. Waste was allowed to accumulate anywhere that was convenient, and there was no thought of remediation. A generation later, the children of the first gold miners had a better grasp of the consequences. The mining industry had gone. Agriculture was expanding, but it was compromised by the damage done. That generation learned from their past and introduced legislation to make their futures better. The future mining that generation imagined is today our present. Because of the way they imagined and planned for their future, today we have environmental effect statements and life of mine plans and all the other tools that can be used to regulate mining's environmental impact. These laws were originally passed for gold mining in Victoria, and that is where industry practices developed. Now they apply mainly in the coal industry. Regulating impact isn't always done well, as we've just seen. There is a well-documented and widespread lack of enforcement and compliance. Nevertheless, the instruments are there, and the mindset of the community has shifted. We also have that legacy of the active choices not to regulate the industry. We have the permanently altered waterways, the unusable voids, the honeycombed ground, and contaminated land. The legacy of that choice shapes not only our present, but the futures of all the generations still to come. Finally, we have the legacy of the unconscious choices. Accidental remediation has been so successful in Victoria that the gold mines have effectively been lost. Vegetation has covered industrial sites, rivers have continued to rework their channels, and processing plants have collapsed into romantic ruins. People have forgotten that these now picturesque places were once industrial sites. That can seem like a good news story, and to some extent it is. Mined landscapes do revegetate, given enough time. But actually, it's not so good. The lack of intervention and purposeful management means that the reality of these places as industrial sites has been lost. Along with it, the toxic legacies that remain in the soils and waterways have also been forgotten. They have become housing estates and veggie gardens, playgrounds for children, and habitats for wildlife. The health and ecosystem consequences of contamination are not addressed, and the ongoing damage is unknown. The message here, then, is that when we are imagining extractive futures, it is just as important to imagine the post-extractive futures that lie beyond, and which will be even more enduring. Thank you.